The Holy Gospel according to John, the 6th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. Now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So picture this, if you will. Let's say we're gathered here for church, for a worship service, for a meal, for a meeting, whatever, and someone happens to look out the window, assuming you could see through the stained glass, and they interrupt everything by shouting, "Look!" And everything that's happening goes silent. Everyone turns and looks toward where that shout came from to see 5,000 people descending upon our church. The people look hot, tired, and hungry. We know it's a holiday for them. It's a holy day for them. It's a day that they normally recognize and celebrate with many things, but one of them being a meal. And so we look out at this crowd of people, and we're all just stunned. None of us know what to say or do. And as the crowd grows larger and larger, and as they get closer and closer, there's one lone voice that breaks through the silence among us. It ends up being the voice of Jesus himself, who says, "Where are we to buy bread for all of these people to eat?" Well, the first thought that crosses our mind in response to that question is that, well, our local grocery store, but they probably don't have enough bread on their shelf for all of this. But then we realize that that's not what Jesus means. He's asking us, what are we going to do to feed all of these hungry people? What are we going to do with this opportunity? Suddenly things have gotten a bit more complicated, right? because there's a way that we got to do things around here, you know? You know, anybody who's on council is probably looking at this crowd and thinking, man, if we have to spend more than $5,000, we got to call a congregational meeting. We don't have time for that. And the worship committee people are sitting here like, well, the service isn't finished. We still have hymns to sing. We still got stuff to do in worship. And our parish ed committee's thinking, well, look at all the kids. We don't have enough teachers or supplies. What are we going to do? And then the people on the budget committee, they're like, we don't have the money for this. It's not in the budget. We didn't plan for this. Right? And then the property people, they're like, well, who's going to set up tables and chairs? Not me. And you see all that grass they're sitting on? What's going to happen to the grass? It's our grass. But then the fair stand committee is like, we got this. Feeding the multitude? That's our thing, right? But then if you go back to 2023, our records, we only sold 4,334 hamburgers in 4 days. So it's a little short. And then the fair stand people are thinking, oh wait, we got to set up the stand a second time? We don't even like doing it a first time. Well, it's too hot outside to fry fish. It's, all the volunteers here, we're stretched too thin. We have too many things going on. There's too many other things and people that are asking for our money. Can't they just feed themselves? That doesn't sound like us. And as all of our voices are raising up, arguing about how we could even do such a thing, Jesus just looks at us. He hushes our congregation and he just says, where are we to buy bread for these people to eat? How many times can the church get in the way of doing the work of God? Now, please don't hear me being seriously critical of what our church does. There are so many good things that we as a congregation, as a church, have and continue to do. Just the other day, I was talking to somebody about this back-to-school clothing sale that's coming up, and they were commenting about how it just started, how many years ago with the PMC team and just a small group of people giving away a little bit of clothing. And look at it now. It's brought all the area churches together to give away piles and piles and piles of secondhand clothing, in addition to all of us contributing and spending thousands of dollars so that these families can receive brand new underwear and socks and shoes. Look at that work. And look how this dream of a long-standing daycare in our community is coming to fruition thanks to the hard work of people here and the support of so many. I mean, look around. We know how to do things and get things done and honor God by serving our neighbors. But how many times does that come at the cost of committees and meetings and thinking about it and then discussing it and then thinking some more about it and then weighing pros and cons and deciding if there's really a need worth addressing, and then a little more thinking and meeting in the parking lot and then maybe voting on it. And Jesus is looking at us just saying, just feed the people. When Jesus presents this issue of feeding that crowd to his disciples, this crowd that's been following him from place to place, his disciples probably start thinking through all of those same things. We are not that different than Jesus' disciples. But then as we know how this story goes, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, one of the disciples, comes forward and he says to Jesus, well, I saw a boy here, and he has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but that's not enough to feed everybody. What could we do? But we know the story. We know that what that little bit of food can turn into when Jesus is involved. Jesus can turn even the smallest offering into an enormous feast. What an amazing story this is. Many call this feeding of the multitude one of Jesus' grandest miracles. It's so important that it shows up over and over again and throughout the Gospels and often repeated by the same writers. It's Jesus doing what Jesus does best. showing the people of his day just what God intends for this world and just how God cares for God's children. I don't know if you've heard this. I've heard a theory, though, about this miracle, that it wasn't as amazing of a miracle as it might sound. The theory goes that just like there was this one boy who was carrying some bread and some fish, that many of the others in the crowd were also carrying food for their journey. The food was out there. And the actual miracle that occurred in this situation was Jesus being able to convince people in the crowd to actually share it with other people. I mean, that can be a miracle, right? So instead of this miraculous multiplying of food, it was really just a giant Passover potluck meal. Because we all know that at a potluck, right, no one is going to take the last bite that's in a dish. Right, there's that little bit still on the spoon, and nobody's going to take it, despite, if that's your favorite food or not, it's going to stay there. So, of course, there were leftovers. It's a potluck. There's always leftovers. Well, I don't mind that take on this miracle. In fact, there are aspects of that theory that I can appreciate. I mean, who can argue against the importance of us working together for the sake of each other? But if you think about that theory of the miracle, ultimately that takes away the power that God has shown through what has happened. The theory would say more about how God coerces us or guilts people into doing the right thing instead of looking at the power of God to multiply what's there. To see how Jesus multiplies this little bit of food that he's given in order to feed the multitude. Seeing that as a witness is a way to witness God's abundant and generous power to feed, to care for, and to show love to all the people in the world who need it. Especially for these people who've been following Jesus from town to town and followed him up the mountainside. They're hoping to see what he's going to do next. And I bet a lot of them are even hoping to experience some of that healing themselves. Over the past few weeks in worship, we've been hearing stories from early in Jesus' ministry through the eyes of Mark and John. And as you've heard in so many of these stories, we've seen how what Jesus is doing is attracting these large crowds along the way. And if you've been listening to these stories, it's probably been painfully obvious as to why he's been attracting these crowds. It's because of what he's doing. In all that he does, he brings healing. He's giving, teaching, preaching messages of hope that can heal a person's soul. And he's been doing signs and miracles that have brought physical healing to those around him. Jesus was offering something that was desperately needed in the world in his day. He was offering the good news of hope and healing, the good news of peace and mercy, the good news of things that can only come from God, the Father and Creator of all things. Jesus was offering love in what often feels like a loveless world. And not by guilting us into having to love one another more, but by bringing and multiplying love from seemingly nothing or from the little bit that's there. He wasn't doing this to gain popularity among the people. In verse 15 of what we just read a little bit ago, John says that when Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again from them to the mountain by himself. He was not there to get the notoriety or the power. We're not called to do these things to try and grow our membership or become the most notable church in the community. We're called to do these things out of humble service and generous love. Maybe who we are as people of God and as a congregation is meant to be a reflection of God's amazing love and amazing grace. Maybe our actions can come not from months of deliberate meetings and deliberations, but maybe these actions can come from selfless compassion and just pure generosity. Because again, that is the good news. This good news that God can take these tiny fragments of hope and love and multiply them and grow them abundantly so that we can all be witnesses to those things, so that we can be givers of those things and we can be recipients of this generous hope and love. I mean, just look around. I can't think of anything more that this world could use these days other than that message of abundant grace and love. Amen.